Hi, and welcome. Today we are going to talk about creative nature photography. So I think the first question we need to answer or address is, why are we talking about creative nature photography? Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. Okay. First of all, I think sometimes we forget why we got into photography. For the fun of it, right? Because you're taking pictures of things that you like to take pictures of and that you want to take pictures of. And then we spiral into this where we have to learn about exposure and exposure compensation, and then we have to learn how to use our camera and file types and learning all the gear and all the technicalities that go into photography. We forget sometimes that it can just be fun. Okay, and so that's why I want to talk a little bit about creative techniques that you can use to bring some of the fun back into your photography. But we don't want to lose sight of why we're taking pictures to begin with, or why we want to show our pictures to someone else. We need to make sure that while we're doing this, that we still highlight the subject, that our photos still have good composition, and guide the viewer's eye through the photo, that we create a certain feel with our photos, and maybe we can only do this or do this a whole lot better with our creative techniques. And above all, it's a way to help communicate your vision, or what you see in your mind's eye when you take your photo. So this is a little bit about me. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about my background. I've got a few years in technology, teaching with technology. I've worked for colleges and universities, and I've been doing photography since about 2004. And now I get to really teach and help people learn about something that I'm passionate about. If you want to know more about my credentials, about some of the awards and contests I've won, if you want to see more about my work, you can go to my website. It's cfh.art. Pretty easy to remember. And there's probably more information than you want to see out there. Okay, the first creative technique that I want to talk about is motion blur. You've seen motion blur. You've seen pictures that have, cars in motion or people in motion. So there are basically three types of motion blur, and they have to do with the camera and the subject. Okay, in one, the subject is moving and the camera is stationary. That's pretty obvious, right? You have several things moving and your camera is stationary. The second is that the subject is stationary, but the camera is moving, and I'll show you some of those in a minute. The third, that you don't think about too much, is that the subject is moving and the camera is moving, and you can see these. I see a lot of these, especially with NASCAR races or motorcycle races. The camera is moving at the same speed as the subject, but the background is going to be blurry, and you get the feel of motion. So why do you use motion blur? Well, photography is a still photo. Okay, that's primarily what we're working with in photography, are still photos. And sometimes you need a way to imply motion or movement in your photo, and so you can do this through motion blur. So for example, I shoot a lot of bird photos, and in this instance you can see the front wing of this cardinal is kind of stationary, but you know he's coming in for a landing, not only from his body positioning, but from the blur that's in that back wing. In this one, you can see that the green jay on the left is sitting there wondering why the other one is invading his territory, but it just got there, and you get that impression that it just got there because the wings are still in motion, and you know that because of the motion blur that you see there. This one is a particularly fun image, all right? This is a female northern cardinal taking a bath in a pool of water. This is a stop motion. Okay? There's no motion blur necessarily when you first look at it. Okay, we froze the water droplets, but if you take a look at the cardinal herself, you'll see that the bird itself, there's some blurring. She was moving so fast that it created a blur. The other thing that you can see if you take a look at it really closely, while the water droplets are frozen in midair, if you look down in the reflection, they are not frozen. And so that's because these water droplets are actually coming toward the camera. And so you pick up that motion in the reflection. So there's a lot going on in this particular photo. In this photo, the subject is not quite stationary because there was a lot of wind, okay, and neither was the camera. The camera was moving, and it really created kind of an abstract effect, except if you think about it or don't think about it so much, it gives you the feel. You know, it's a field of flowers. It's an abstract. It's an impressionistic view of a field of flowers. These are another field of sunflowers, not the same field and not the same sunflowers, but in this case, the camera was moving. The subject was pretty still. Okay, it was a very still evening, and the camera has moved just slightly. It could have been because I was standing in the back of a pickup while I was taking this picture. But what it's done for it is it's created kind of a painterly effect. And I print this on a large canvas, which further blurs the image, and it really does. It looks pretty good, if I have to say so. In this instance, the camera is moving or panning vertically, right, up and down the flowers. It's still kind of an abstract effect. You get the idea that these are plants and flowers with bright spots of color. Okay, and so not every situation is going to work well with a vertical pan. You'll just have to see kind of what works. If you're doing waves at the beach, horizons, a horizontal pan works better. This is an instance where the camera and the subject were panning together. Okay, I was looking down off of Alcatraz. We're on the cliffs of Alcatraz, and I was panning along with the bird, but you can see everything in the background. You can see that blurring and that panning, so you know that bird is just swooping over that water. This is another instance of panning with the subject. You can tell from the background that the camera was moving because of the lines in the background, the blurry background. You can also see that the bird was flapping its wings. There's still enough definition here that you can tell what the subject is. You know immediately what's going on. It's the evening because there's the backlighting of the wings and the bird is flying over the water. It wouldn't look the same with the still photo. This bobcat, everything about this bobcat is in motion except for her head. She is focused on something behind us, and she kept her head stationary while she kept walking. And so you can see her front paw was moving a little bit faster than everything else, but there's still some motion blur going on in there. So you get the feeling of movement. All right, so we've seen some examples. Let's talk about how to actually use your camera and get motion blur. So you first of all should consider shooting in manual mode or shutter priority mode. A shutter priority mode is going to let you control the shutter speed, and then the camera will take care of the rest of the exposure. In manual mode, you have to take care of all of the exposure elements. You need to use a slower shutter speed, a longer shutter speed. Shutter speed is measured in time, in seconds, and so the longer you leave the shutter open, the more motion blur you can capture. There's a point where you can go too far though. So what is considered slow? How slow is slow? Well, we'll get there, all right? We'll get there. Let's just take a look at shutter speeds in this scale. So we talk about shutter speeds in stops, like we do in all the exposure areas. So if we go from a 1 second shutter speed, that means leaving the shutter open for 1 second, to a shutter speed of 2 seconds, we've doubled the time, right? We've doubled the amount of light that is coming into the camera. So you've given the subject longer to move, so you're capturing more of that movement, but you're also letting in more light. Conversely, if you go from 2 seconds to 1 second, you cut the light in half. Yep. All right. Some cameras will let you control shutter speed down to 1/3 of a stop. Right? You don't have to just do everything at a full stop. So I wouldn't have to go from 1 second to 2 seconds. I could go from 1 second to 1.5 seconds or 1 1/3 seconds, those kinds of things. So each camera is going to be different, and so you'll need to check with your camera manual and documentation to see what your camera settings are. So how slow is slow? Let's get back to that question. Well, that depends. Okay, it depends on the speed of the subject or the speed of your camera movement, and it depends on the brightness of the scene, because there is a chance or a risk of overexposure. So let's take a look at this photo. Okay, I was doing more panning at Alcatraz. The birds were flying all over the place. When I look at this thing, the first thing I think of is The Flying Nun. I don't know if you remember that television series with Sally Field. Okay, that is what I see when I look at that. I don't see a bird. I don't even like it. So this was too long. Okay, I've overexposed it. Not that it's blown out, but I've held the shutter open too long so that you have no idea what this subject is. Now, if I was going for a full-blown abstract, I could have maybe even lengthened the subject, and then it would have, looked totally abstract. So for reference, these are just some reference numbers, and of course, there are exceptions to every rule, so these are not rules. But if you have your shutter speed at 1/1000th of a second, and faster, okay, that will freeze almost all motion. Almost all motion. It probably won't get hummingbirds' wings, but it will get a large percentage of the majority of things frozen. 1/250th of a second stops most motion. Okay, most movement, most motion. In fact, when I'm shooting wildflowers, this is where I start, because that will freeze almost all movement created by wind, right? And my flower will be still and frozen in the image. So most of the time I start with 1/250th. 1/60th of a second stops most casual human action, okay? It also stops most animal movement, just kind of walking and talking. It's not going to stop running, though. You need to go a little bit faster than that. And 1/30th and a slower is a good place to start when you're thinking about creating motion blur. But everything is dependent, like we said before, on the movement of the subject as well as the movement of the camera. Okay, so let's revisit some of these photos. The hummingbird. These are my camera settings. 1/125th of a second. Now, normally for a hummingbird photo, that is way too slow of a shutter speed. It only works because that bird is keeping its body very still, and only the wings are moving. So that works. 1/125th of a second at f8 with an aperture of f8, ISO 640. Those are the three things you need to think about in exposure, right? Exposure triangle. For the bobcat, 1/140th of a second. Not even down to 1/30th, but it was very dark, and I had the aperture wide open at 5.6 and the ISO. So it was very dark that evening, and so at these settings, that's what it took to capture that movement. So the speed of your subject comes into play as well as the lighting conditions. For the northern cardinal, I captured this bird at 1/1250th of a second. That's a pretty fast shutter speed. It was enough to freeze the water droplets in midair, but still not enough to freeze the movement of the bird. So I've got motion blur. So you can see that this varies, and it really does depend on your subject's movement. For the field of sunflowers, the shutter speed was 1/15th of a second, extremely slow. But again, I was there in the evening. I've got my aperture, it's kind of small. Okay, it's getting down into the smaller region. And the ISO was a normal starting ISO. So as I mentioned earlier, the longer shutter speed lets more light into the camera, and so you have a risk of overexposing the image. So therefore, whenever I'm doing long exposure and trying to get motion blur, I'm going to not shoot on manual. I'm going to choose shutter priority, and then I let the camera decide what the aperture needs to be, because I'm not worried about anything else other than the shutter speed and the movement of things going on around me. You know, the last thing that I would say about motion blur is just let go and have some fun and try a lot of different things. There may be some things that you try that you never even thought would work. For example, this is a field of bluebonnets near where I live, and I wouldn't normally have thought to do this sort of vertical motion with a field of flowers like this, especially with the building in the background. But it kind of works, right? You get the idea. You're in it's a landscape, you know it's a landscape, it's flowers, and there's a building in the back. And I really do like this. I've used it as a background for a lot of advertising images. Here are some more flowers. You kind of even get the shape. They're kind of star-shaped flowers. The vertical movement works really well for this. And then here's another bird. And in this instance, the bird is a little out of focus. There's a little movement in the bird, but I like the diagonal of it. And then you can see the concrete pillars there. Now, sometimes you can go too far, and people do this a lot with water. They're not capturing the motion blur, but they're using long exposure. And so what ends up happening with water is that it ends up being very, very smooth. So if you're, especially out here off of the coast of Galveston, you don't see any of the movement of the water. And you wouldn't get any crashing waves or anything because the exposure was just too long, and so everything has smoothed out. You can see that it's a long exposure because there were some people moving on the pier, and you can kind of see their shadows there. And what happens if you're interested in trying to get people out of your photo with long exposure, if you leave it open long enough, they can walk through and they won't ever show up in your photo. So there you go. That's an extra bit of information. So the next creative technique I want to talk about is depth of field. And this is one that I like to use as well. What depth of field helps you do is focus on the subject, right? It helps bring attention to the subject. So what is depth of field? Well, when you expose on a subject or you focus on a subject, there's a focal plane. Everything that is parallel to the sensor in your camera is in focus. And you know that it goes as far as the lens can see, right? Vertically. But there is also some depth to that focal plane. And the depth of that focal plane is called the depth of field. There is a certain area in front of your focal point as well as behind your focal point that is in focus. That is the depth of field. Now, how deep is that? Well, that depends on a lot of things. It depends on your lens. It depends on your aperture. And it depends on the type of camera that you're using. So the sensor does affect the depth of field. So here's one photo where I used depth of field to bring attention to the subject. Again, more bluebonnets, right? It's kind of a big deal where I live. So the depth of field, you can see everything behind this pink bluebonnet. Pink bluebonnet, yeah. Every once in a while you get an anomaly show up in the field of bluebonnets. And so I wanted to really take a picture of this particular one. So everything behind it is blurred out. Or blurry, not blurred out necessarily. I spent a lot of time working with these birds, and there was a whole row of fence posts, and these birds kept landing, and they would land, several of them in a row, but I really only wanted to focus on the one bird. So I selected a depth of field where the fence post in front of the bird and everything behind the bird was blurred out, or blurry, not in focus. This is also another area where I try to highlight certain flowers in this group, and you can see the depth of field is pretty shallow here. I'm pretty sure this was taken with the macro lens. So what happens in exposure, we'll do a quick recap, is that light shines on your subject, it's reflected into your camera lens, it goes through the opening of the lens, which is the aperture, and it strikes the sensor. So that you control your depth of field by controlling the size of the aperture. If you think of the light coming through the aperture like flowing, kind of like water does out of a faucet, you're controlling how much light flows through that lens to strike that sensor by adjusting the aperture. The longer the shutter has to stay open with a smaller aperture, the more of your picture is in focus, so the greater the depth of field. So let's take a look real quick. At an aperture of f1.4, the opening is very, very large, so a lot of light comes through there, and your depth of field is very shallow. As we go farther along down to f22, you can see the opening is very, very small, but your depth of field is going to be very deep. So if you want to think about it this way, the number kind of gives you an indication of the depth of field. The larger the number, the larger the depth of field, but the smaller the opening. Okay, there's that inverse relationship that really trips a lot of people up. So here's an example of a large or a very deep depth of field. This is an air hockey table, and I focused on this front paddle, and you can see that everything is in focus, even the back wall. Okay, everything's in focus. If I change my aperture to f4.4, which is a big difference, right? And I'm still focusing on that front paddle, you can see how everything behind it is blurry, and even some things in front of it. So the depth of field is much narrower, or shallow. So depth of field is what's in focus, okay? And then things outside of it are a little blurry. And sometimes we refer to that blurriness as bokeh, or the quality of the blurriness. You can't just necessarily have blurry things and they look good. You need to think about the quality of the blur, and that we call that bokeh. A lot of that is dependent, almost entirely, I would say, on the lens. So let's take a look at this. You see behind it, you can see there are gradations in light, so there's something lighter in the back, but it's very smooth transition from the light to the dark. And so we kind of like that bokeh. There's a shallow depth of field. This is in focus, this is not in focus. With this picture, this basket flower, you can really see the bokeh in the background and how nice and painterly the blurriness is. This one, while the depth of field is pretty shallow, it's not a really good background. Okay, these things in the background were too close for them to really create a good bokeh. So you need to pay attention to the background as well when you're trying to do shallow depth of field pictures. In this instance, the background foliage was maybe 20 yards away, so there was a lot of distance between the bird and what was behind it, so it has a really nice soft bokeh. So in this instance, I cut out this section of the photo to enlarge it over there, and if you can see those white circular dots in there, that's kind of what we're looking at when we're talking about bokeh. Okay, what is the quality of those circular dots? And in this case, I think it's the highlights from the dew that was still in the flower. You don't want those to be solid. They need to be blurry, they need to be soft, and that's what you consider to be a good bokeh. So this one's a little bit better. You can see on that right side there's kind of that pink circle. You can see that there are some things up there. It's just because the way that the light comes through the lens, the things are rendered in circles. These are very soft. This is a very nice bokeh. Here's another example of a picture with some bokeh, and it's got a shallow depth of field. You can see that the dirt in front of the bobwhite quail is blurry as well as that behind it, but all of the bird is perfectly in focus. So the bird is inside that depth of field. There's a little bit of bokeh you can see on the lower right in that dirt, the blurry part of the picture. But one of the things that, and until I mention it, you probably haven't seen it, but one of the things that bothers me about this picture is this right here. Not because it's a solid, hard circle with solid edges. I think primarily because it's so much lighter than the rest of it. And so I'm going to make a note to myself to go back and fix that. Okay, here's another example of a good bokeh. So you can still have a busy background, but you can still get good bokeh. These things weren't too far away. They were maybe 3 feet behind this one. But so this is, you'll need to consider what lens. Macro lenses do really, really, really well with this, and they get good bokeh. If you're not using a macro lens that allows you to have a really large aperture, then you might want to make sure that the background items are a significant distance away from your primary subject. Here's another example. You can tell I take a lot of bluebonnets. It's kind of a big deal in Texas in the spring, and they sell pretty well. So I have a lot of them. This is actually my front yard. I have some that just grow. They've taken off and grow wild. There's a really nice bokeh here. A shallow depth of field. It's very shallow. This flower is probably not even 3 inches across. So my depth of field is really shallow, you can tell. Again, this is a backlit photo in a field of other plants and flowers, but I've gotten down close enough that and used a very shallow depth of field because you can see the back of the flower is not in focus, right? So there's a good bokeh for this one. And this one as well. This is one of my favorites. There's a good story here. You can see the grasshopper on the flower kind of giving me the stink eye to go away. And then you've got the other patches of color from the other flowers. But they're not distracting because they're a soft bokeh. So thank you for sticking with me through this presentation. I hope you've learned something. If you have any questions about anything, please feel free to reach out and connect with me. You can email me, carol@cfh.art. If you want to take a look at my website, here's that address again. I would ask you to follow me on Facebook. I have a Facebook page, and I'm pretty active on Instagram as well. If you want to go to my website and sign up for my newsletter, I'd love for you to do that, and I'll keep you abreast of any new activities and adventure stories and new workshops and other things that I do. So, thank you very much.